Hey everybody, here's the overview video that I promised. Let's finally review the Xero Connector PowerBI Custom Connector code. This code is on GitHub, make sure to check it out. Alright, so the file tree looks something like this, but the only two files worth looking at are the xeroconnector.pq and xeroconnector.query.pq. Actually, the second one is optional. It's just a playground to test the connector code. And you've guessed it correctly, PQ stands for Power Query. Now, the second file can be broken into three parts: the metadata, the actual Xero communication code, and the OAuth logic. The OAuth part seems huge, but it turns out that Power Query already knows how to do OAuth, so all this code is really just preparing and extracting the data at various places. What places? There are three touch points: before the user logs in, after the user logs in, and when the token expires and Power Query tries to refresh it using a refresh token. As said in the first video, the only way to do OAuth is using a custom connector, so OAuth is an important ingredient here. If you want to learn more about how OAuth works with Xero, be sure to check out my other tutorial. Here's a quick refresher. Power Query needs to open a small Chrome window where the user will log in. It needs to get the login URL from you. This is done in the start login function. When Power Query has the login URL, it will launch that URL and let the user finish the login. Once that's done, the little Chrome window will get redirected to a special URL, which will also contain a special code which we will need. Power Query will listen to the URL changes and trigger the finish login method. That method will extract the authorization code from the URL and then pass it to another method called token method. Oh man, so many methods. This new method will exchange the authorization code for auth token, which Power Query will then use to authenticate the requests. Don't worry if this was too fast, here's a full review. Oh, hey, you're still here. Please subscribe, leave a comment and a like, and let's keep going. Right, so this is the situation that I'm at the moment. So I have my Xero Connector project open in Visual Studio Code, and as we discussed, this .query.pq file and this .pq, these are the most important files in this project. So this query.pq is just kind of a playground where you can write your queries, where you can actually use the code that you wrote. In my example, that's xeroconnector.contents. That's the function that I wrote. Basically, you can do the exact same thing in Power BI or Excel or Power Query Editor. It doesn't matter. This is just kind of a local way to test the functionality before actually deploying the solution to Excel or Power Query. Let's not waste any more time and get right into the interesting stuff. So .pq file. At the top we have this section declaration, which is in every .pq file within custom projects. And then we have the client ID. I believe I showed you that in the original video. Then we have the required scopes. If you don't remember where to get this, be sure to check out the first video again. These are just two numbers which don't really play any significant role here. They just determine how big the login pop-up will be, and you'll see that just in a second, or you already saw that if you checked out the first video. So then we have the redirect URI. This is standard Power BI stuff, and I believe I also showed you that in the first video, so be sure to check that out. Then we have the base URL, and I'll show you where this is used in a second. Then we have the Xero Connector record, which defines how the authentication will work. This is actually what brings everything together. It contains this authentication record. This is also record. It contains this OAuth key. If I was to support multiple authentication methods, I could also list them in here, but I will not change that, not to break anything. But Xero only supports OAuth. It also supports other authentication methods, as I explained in the OAuth video. But yeah, for now, just remember that OAuth requires a couple of methods, of a couple of functions to be implemented. So these are start login, which will run, I'll explain that just in a second, but this will run before the little browser window opens and the OAuth starts. This will run when the browser window closes, and this will parse the code from the final URL. This function will run when Power BI tries to refresh the authentication token using a refresh token, and this is just a simple label which will appear in the sidebar which will appear in a little window within Power BI when you try to actually establish a connection to Xero. And then we also have this test connection field, which is just a simple function returning a string. This is a name of the method, and Power BI will call this method when it's trying to test the connection. So when you log into Xero using your credentials, and when you interact with the browser, after this occurs, after this happens, after the little window closes, Power BI will just run this test connection function again, just to ensure that it can run it. So it must succeed. So in order for you to be able to add this OAuth, this test connection must also succeed. I believe this is more important when publishing to powerbi.com, but yeah, this needs to be implemented. This is by documentation, so it's here. Okay, now moving forward to the start login function. Start login function actually starts the OAuth flow, and its sole purpose is to construct and return a little record here. And this record contains a couple of important parameters. This login URI, so just as a reminder, the OAuth flow is an interactive thing. So this means that the user actually needs to interact with a web browser to make it work. So, and Power Query does exactly this. So it opens up a new small pop-up browser window with this exact height and width, and it launches this login URI. And you see this authorize URI is something we're building here, and it has quite a lot of things here that we still need to review. So yeah, it launches this login URI, it lets the user authenticate, and then it returns the authorization code as a callback URI. By return, what I mean is that Xero actually sends a 302 HTTP request, which is basically a redirect, and it redirects the browser to this redirect URI. It's something that we specify, and it's this constant which Power BI is listening for, which Power Query is listening for. So when this small browser window gets redirected to this URL plus whatever comes after this, it continues with the operation. It launches this finish login method, to be exact. But yeah, we must specify this callback URL, which will be which we will get redirected to when everything goes smoothly. And then we have this context, which I'll explain just in a second. So to build this authorized URL, we first need to specify the endpoint. This is specified by Xero. So you can see this is the base endpoint, and then we have the question mark, which is a sign for parameters. And you can see that we will be passing these parameters, and Power BI has a very nice feature. It's this URI.buildQueryString function, which takes in a record and it produces a nicely formatted URL parameters string like this. So yeah, we're passing the things that Xero actually requires. It's this response type equals to code. Then we have the client ID. This is specified in the beginning. We reviewed that, as well as scopes. Scopes is also passed here. Then we have the state. The state is actually a random string. It's in OAuth specification, and actually Power Query takes care of this. So state is already provided for us, so we're just passing that forward, and Power BI just does the rest for us. Then this redirect URI is the exact same thing as seen above. So it's the static parameter, is the static URI, which we will get redirected to, but Xero also needs to be aware of that. And then we have the code challenge method, which stands, and this is a string which defines what hashing function we will use. This is just specified by Xero, so yeah, nothing to do here. And finally, we have this code challenge, which is this code verifier. It's another string, but there are some rules on how to prepare it. What Xero requires is it requires for us to pass a challenge. So first we will call this URL, and then we need to pass a code verifier. This is a string which I'll explain just in a second. And when everything goes smoothly, we will receive what's called an authorization code, I believe. Authorization code, yeah. We will receive authorization code, and then we will need to exchange this authorization code for our authorization token, for the bearer token. So yeah, in order to get that, we first need to pass the code verifier, which is kind of an encrypted, if you want. So it's a hashed string, it's a random hash string. But what Xero requires us to do is to be able to provide it the same unencrypted string back to it. And this means that we're the same kind of a person, same client. There are probably more reasons for that. So it needs to be encoded, and we're using this SHA function, and then we are just encoding that into base 64. There's a little inline function. This is copied straight from the examples. This benc is just a properly formatted base 64 encoding. So yeah, we're making this plain text code verifier using two GUIDs. GUID is basically a random string. That seems like a good random thing, and we're just concatenating two of them together to get the length that's required by 0. And that's our plain text code verifier. So then we're encoding that and passing that to this endpoint as our code challenge. And then as the final step, we are passing this plain text code verifier, so the unencrypted, unencoded string as a context, and this context will get passed forward to this finish login method. So when this finish login is run, it will receive three things. It will receive this context, which will be our plain text code verifier. It will be our callback URI. So this will be the final URI which the browser is at, and it will also this callback URI will also contain the authorization code. This is what we need to extract from this URL, and this is exactly what we're doing here. So this URI.parts actually takes in this callback URI, and it breaks the URI apart. And as you can see, we're extracting this query part of the URI here. And right, so and what this does is it then just passes all of these things into this token method. Okay, so token method is the final piece of magic that's bringing everything together here. So it receives the code, which can be either a refresh token or authorization code, and it uses this grant type parameter to define which type of token it is. If it receives the grant type of authorization code, this code will actually be an authorization code, and vice versa if it receives this refresh token. So as you can see here, this refresh method calls the token method again. It passes the refresh token that receives from as a parameter, and it passes this refresh token grant type as a parameter. And in case of authorization code, we're also receiving this plain text code verifier, which we need to pass in order to get the actual access token back from the endpoint. So yeah, these are the parameters. And the actual important thing that this token method does is it sends a post request. As you can see here, this is a post request because it has this content key here. It calls this endpoint, passes the query parameters which we're building here above, and it just receives a whole bunch of things as JSON. It's parsing this. It receives the refresh token. It receives the authorization code, practically everything that we need to authenticate further requests. So, and in order to be able to call this endpoint properly, we need to construct this query. So we're passing some constants here. So client ID, the grant type that we're receiving here, and the redirect URI, which we've seen before, at least 2 times. Then we have this code parameter, and we need to name the parameter correctly. So if we're receiving the authorization code, then we need to name the query parameter as code. If we're receiving a refresh token, we need to name it accordingly, but we're just receiving a single code here. So this little if statement here creates the correct keys in these records, so that it can be nicely merged then into the final thing. And as the last step, we need to pass the code verifier, the plain text code verifier, and we're just checking if the verifier is null. In this case, if it is null, we're passing nothing because that's not required. But if we do receive the verifier, then we're just creating a new record, and this record then gets nicely merged into the final query parameters. And these query parameters are then serialized using this URI.build query string. As you can see here, this is not JSON, but rather form URL encoded. This is something really common. So yeah, but that's basically it. We have some error checking, but apart from that, that's basically it. This is the token method. All right, good job on making it so far. We're basically done with the OAuth part, and we'll be focusing on zero communication right now, finally. And then we'll shed some light on the metadata part, and that's basically it. So let's keep going. Okay, moving on to zero communication. As you can see, there's a huge comment here explaining all the credential matching magic and everything. But yeah, the most important part here is the zero connector.contents. This is the actual function. As you can see, it's shared. So this means that you can actually call this using Power BI inside Power BI. But what it does is it actually just wraps this zero.contents function, which actually does the job. And it just casts it, so it replaces its type to conform to whatever Power BI actually requires. I tried using it without that, just making zero connector this into this function, but it somehow didn't work. Not sure why I didn't dig any deeper, but anyway, I'm just keeping that. I saw that in the docs, so it seems legit, and yeah. All right, so yeah, but apart from just wrapping this function, this shared function also has this decorator here. Not sure if that's the way it's called in Power Query, but anyway, so it defines this data source.kind, and as discussed in the other video, this is the link between the authentication and the actual function. And as you can see, this zero connector is actually a link to this block here above, so to this record here, which defines the authentication types and test connection and everything which we already discussed. Let me just get down. And yeah, so this is a way to define the authentication type. And then we also have some more publishing settings. Yeah, let me just show you that. So here in the zero connection, the connector.ui, this is also defined here below, and this is just some additional metadata. So obviously this connector is still in beta. Then we have some text definitions. Now this extension.load string is actually getting the data from this RSX file from here. So yeah, this is another file, not so important, but if we check this formula title, let me do Control F and Control V, we have this data name, formula title, and we have this zero connector here. So not sure exactly where, but somewhere this text will appear, and it will it'll show this value, this zero connector. So that's it. Then we have, and then at the end we have the images. So source image and source image type. These are the icons that will appear within Power BI. So, and as you can see, we have another record here defining the icons. And so this 016 and all the other sizes are actually present here in the folder. So yeah, we're now basically through all of the files except for this project file, but I never touched it, so it's not important. But back to the main function. So you know now what this publish means. It just defines the metadata. And now on to the most important part, which is actually the function that calls zero. So as you can see, all the parameters here are optional, which means that we have to define some defaults. So what happens if we just call zero connector.contents without any parameters? That's a good question. So the final thing that this function does is it calls whatever URL it calculates, and it passes these default headers and this tenant ID as a parameter here. So this is a GET request because there's no content here, and then this JSON is then deserialized and passed forward to Power BI. But yeah, this URL is still a question. So, and URL is calculated in this way. So if the endpoint, if the first parameter is null, then we're using this connections path, and it's using this base URL and this connections. So if the zero.contents or zero connector.contents function is called without any parameters, it will just return a list of all organizations, a list of all companies that you have approved removed during the login process. This is what it will do, and you can also see that if you check out the xeroconnector.query.pq. Here we're using exactly that. So we're using first xeroconnector.contents without any parameters whatsoever, and we're using the first record from the result, and we're extracting the tenant ID property from this result. And then we're using this xeroconnector.contents again, and we're passing this organization here as a second parameter. And you can also see that here. So the second parameter is this tenant ID, and we have these additional parameters, but it seems that this is not used anywhere. This could as well be removed, but this might come in handy later if you want to add any additional parameters. You can actually specify all the parameters through the endpoint at the moment, because this is just a GET request, but let's not go into any details, shall we? But yeah, at the moment this is completely unused, but it could be used for something in the future. So yeah. And that's basically it. So then the URL is constructed using this base URL, which is defined at the top. Connections, we have the default headers just to define that we want JSON as the output. And then we're just parsing the JSON. And that's basically the whole magic. Congrats, we're done. Phew, that was a long video. Sorry for that. But yeah, there were lots of things to cover. I hope you now understand what this code does and how everything is structured. Because in the future videos, I'll be upgrading this connector to make it even more user-friendly, to allow for more organizations, not organizations, but credentials, and so on. We'll see where this takes us. But if you like this video, make sure to subscribe and leave any comments. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one. Cheers, bye.